Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. We have an exciting show for you tonight. I had the great pleasure and honor of visiting Mexico a few weeks ago, and I toured a protest that's been going on for more than 2.5 years where they're growing cannabis at the front door of Mexico's federal Senate, right at the biggest intersection in Mexico City. So I made a little video of our tour there, and I interviewed this fellow, Miguel Fernandez. We've had other people, one other guy on from Planton 420, but he'll be back in just a second. We have some great hip news for you tonight, but first we'll bring on our infamous dancing, cannabis, leave.
I feel the force.
Okay, our hip news segment tonight. Voters in 5 states, Arkansas, Maryland, Missouri, and North Dakota, and South Dakota, will decide next Tuesday on statewide ballot measures to legalize the use of marijuana by adults. Voters in a 6th state, Oklahoma, will also decide the issue during a special election to be held in March. They're kind of kept off the ballot until then. Currently, 19 states comprising 44% of the U.S. population have legalized and regulated adult use marijuana markets. If voters approve these 5 new measures, approximately half of all U.S. residents will reside in a jurisdiction where the possession and use of cannabis are legal for adults. In 2020, voters in Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota approved similar adult use legalization measures. South Dakota's election results were later nullified by South Dakota State's Supreme Court. In 2016, California, Massachusetts, Maine, and Nevada voters approved similar initiatives. In this age of hyper-partisan politics, legalizing and regulating marijuana is one of the few political issues that voters on both sides of the ideological right and left agree upon. In addition to these statewide efforts, voters in dozens of cities will be deciding on municipal ballot questions this fall. For instance, voters in 5 Texas cities, Denton, Elgin, Harker Heights, Killeen, and San Marcos, where there are some nice caves, will decide on measures seeking to amend local laws curtailing police officers' authority to issue citations or make arrests for Class A or Class B misdemeanor possession of marijuana offenses, absent a defendant's alleged involvement in a, quote, felony-level narcotics case, end quote. Voters in several Ohio cities will also decide on municipal measures depenalizing activities involving marijuana possession. These additional local efforts help create pressure from the ground up. We're reaching out to voters in these localities to ensure that they're registered to vote, know about the issues on the ballot, and get out to the ballot box. Between local and state efforts, these initiatives will affect over 18 million Americans. In Rhode Island, voters in 31 towns will decide on measures determining whether or not to allow licensed cannabis retailers in their localities, where Rhode Island does allow that. Voters in cities in several other states, including Colorado, Michigan, and Montana, will also decide on similar local ballot measures. In economics, cannabis cultivated in 2021 for the state legal adult use market possessed a wholesale harvest cash value of more than $5 billion, making it the nation's 6th most valuable cash crop. And that's just the legal crop, not including the illegal crop. And that's according to an analysis provided by Leafly.com and Whitney Economics. Only corn, soybeans, hay, wheat, and cotton bring in more money on a wholesale basis than cannabis. In 3 states, Alaska, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, cannabis grown for the legal marketplace is the single most valuable crop. As of October 2022, adults in 15 states can obtain cannabis products in state-licensed retail stores. The report determined that those 15 states support 13,297 active legal cannabis farms, which employ tens of thousands of full-time workers. The authors further determined that the total amount of cannabis grown in these states rose 24% year over year, totaling 2,834 metric tons in 2021. Legalizing and regulating cannabis provides for more job opportunities, greater tax revenues, and safe access to high-quality products at increasingly affordable prices. This economic data shows once again why legalization is a preferable policy option over criminal prohibition. Despite ranking among America's top agricultural crops, those involved in the legal cannabis market continue to face many hurdles unique to the industry, such as overtaxation, no banking or loan availability, high insurance rates, and high licensing fees. Furthermore, the United States Department of Agriculture fails to compile data regarding the production and sale of cannabis, and many state agencies also fail to do so. It's time to end the stigma attached to cannabis farming, the authors of this report concluded. They said, quote, far too many state agricultural agencies and policymakers still treat cannabis growers with contempt. Some right to farm laws specifically exclude cannabis farming. Most cannabis farmers must, by law, hide their crops from public view as if the mere sight of a fan leaf of marijuana might induce intoxication. These unfair and unnecessary measures are taken against a legal crop that's one of the top agricultural products in every adult use state. Our next story is from Washington, D.C. Washington's Mayor Muriel Bowser has signed legislation increasing cannabis possession limits for authorized patients and permitting non-residents access to the city's medical marijuana dispensaries. Under the new law, which still must undergo congressional review, authorized medical cannabis patients who reside in the District of Columbia may legally possess up to 8 ounces of herbal cannabis. Previous regulations capped patients' possession limits at 4 ounces. Additionally, the measure provides a process for non-residents qualifying patients to apply for temporary registration cards. Those who receive identification cards will be able to legally enter and purchase cannabis products from District of Columbia, Washington dispensaries. Temporary non-resident ID cards are valid for 30 days. The legislation is the latest change to the district's cannabis policies. In July, the mayor signed legislation removing the requirement that adults seeking to purchase cannabis products from licensed DC medical cannabis dispensaries must obtain a recommendation from a licensed physician. Instead, individuals aged 21 or older may now self-certify that they are utilizing cannabis for medical purposes when they register with local regulators for a medical cannabis identification card. Over 22,000 DC residents are legally authorized to access medical cannabis. Also in July, the mayor signed legislation, the Cannabis Employment Protections Amendment of 2022, protecting those who use cannabis from facing discrimination in the workplace. Well, our last story tonight is from Little Rock, Arkansas. Cannabis smoke is distinctly different from tobacco, and its exposure is not linked to an elevated risk of either lung cancer or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD, according to literature reviewed published in the journal Medical Clinics of North America. The researchers affiliated with the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences reviewed data assessing the potential impact of cannabis smoke exposure on pulmonary health. They reported that marijuana smoking is associated with an increased risk of bronchitis, but that it is likely not responsible for lung disease, small airway injury, COPD, or lung cancer. The authors wrote, quote, the data on marijuana contrasts starkly with the consistent demonstration of injury from tobacco. The authors concluded any possible toxicity of marijuana pales in comparison, end quote. The review's findings are consistent with those of numerous other studies determining that the long-term respiratory effects of cannabis differ from those associated with traditional smoking, and that those who exclusively smoke cannabis possess a reduced level of exposure to harmful toxicants and carcinogens than do those who smoke tobacco cigarettes. Moreover, the use of vaporization technology, which heats herbal cannabis to a set temperature below the point of combustion, is associated with even further reductions in exposure to toxic gases and has been identified as a, quote, safe and effective cannabis delivery device in clinical trial settings. This study is called Marijuana and the Lungs, Evolving Understandings, and appears in this month's issue of Medical Clinics of North America. That is the end of our Hemp News segment tonight. Now we go into our interview with Miguel Fernandez at Planton 420 in Mexico City. I went there to Mexico, and we have a brief video of that. So stay tuned and help us restore hemp. I would like to introduce to our audience and on the show Miguel Fernandez, who works with the Planton 420 movement, which started in front of the Mexican Senate about 2.5 years ago, growing protest cannabis garden. You want to tell our audience about Planton 420, Miguel?
Yeah. Hi, Paul. Thank you very much for the invitation. We started Planton 420 on February of 2019, and this idea of starting like a permanent protest, a permanent sit-in in front of the Mexican Senate, comes from the fact that we reach jurisprudence for the personal use of cannabis cultivation, cannabis possession, and so the legislative power that had to come up with a federal bill for cannabis regulation was the Mexican Senate. So that's why we decided to protest in front of them.
They're the
In
ones
theory,
who write the bills, right? And then
exactly. Well,
then
there's,
do the,
I mean, there's also the Mexican Congress, and it depends on the subject matter. But the bill might be written by Congress and then subjected to the Senate for review, or the other way around. So in this case, we can say like what we call the chamber of origin for the bill was the Mexican Senate, and it needs to be approved as well by the Mexican Congress.
I see. And tell our audience why this isn't something they did on their own. They were forced into this like you said, via jurisprudence. So the court actually told them.
So what happened?
How that happened.
I think Mexico has a unique opportunity in the history of the world in terms of drug policies because we're winning battles in the courts. So the first battle was won by MUCDE, which would be like an organization. The translation would be Mexico United Against Crime, and so they started the first litigious strategy for an amparo, which would be similar to an injunction. So an amparo is a tool that we use in Mexico when you want to sue the state, if you want to see it that way, and to get protection, to protect your personal human rights, you can get an amparo against a state action, against a law, or any type of action coming from the state. So the first amparo was won against the Mexican health laws, and so this first amparo, what gave MUCDE, this organization, was the right to cultivate and possess as many plants as they wanted without the intention of selling them. It's all for personal use. And so if you get 5 of these injunctions in the Supreme Court, you get jurisprudence. And so we could say the legislative powers are obligated to fix an issue of constitutionality. So that's what happened. So right now, there's so many amparos now for individual people for their personal use of cannabis. And we've been waiting over 3 years for a federal regulation because in theory, that's what the Senate had to come up with. The first time frame that was given to them by the court was 90 days. So we thought at first that the planton was only going to be for 90 days. Turns out after 3 years, we're still there. We still don't have any type of time frame or timeline for a federal regulation. We're still waiting on the Senate. There's been a couple of proposals, but they really haven't gotten too far. So at this point, the court, the Senate, they didn't want to pass the bill after several extensions, and they finally said, well, you know what, hold us in contempt because we're not ready to pass a federal bill for marijuana. So yeah, what can you do? What can the court do? They can't throw them in jail. So the court, when the Senate does not abide in these changes of inconstitutionality that they have to do, now the court emits something called a general declaration of inconstitutionality. So now this is a form that the court guarantees that these articles that are deemed unconstitutional no longer violate human rights of individuals. And so now you don't need an amparo. You still need to go to COFEPRIS, which would be like our FDA, in order to get a sanitary authorization to cultivate and possess marijuana.
I see. Is the FDA like agency? Are they issuing those?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it was deemed by the court that they were the authority that had to issue these permits. So yeah, right now they're the ones that have to issue a permit if you want to grow or possess cannabis legally in Mexico.
How many of those permits have been issued, or can you say?
Well, but by now, thousands. I mean, it's not on public record. You could solicit the information maybe through, we have like a governmental agency that's like the Agency of Transparency. So we're looking into that now, seeing how many of these injunctions were won and how many sanitary authorizations have been provided. But now it's in the thousands, right? So we're
I want one.
you can definitely have one. I mean, if you don't even have to be like a Mexican citizen, but if you live in Mexico, you can get one.
I'm going back to Guadalajara in less than 2 weeks. So
yeah.
Anyway, so Mexico is unique in this ruling that marijuana prohibition violates human rights. That it
Exactly.
individual's right to personality development, I think is the phrase in English, right?
Yeah, the way that I see it, like it would be similar as the pursuit of happiness. But
Yeah,
yeah, the term is the freedom to develop your personality. So in order to do that, the Supreme Court determined like what would be the thesis statement, right? Or what is the question that they had to answer? And the question is marijuana cultivation and consumption for personal use, is that a big risk for public safety and a big risk for public health? And is that risk big enough to violate human rights of individuals? And so the answer to the question is no, it's not enough to violate the rights of individuals. So that question being answered is very important for drug policy, not just here, but everywhere in the world, because that's tying something that I interpret as the development of my consciousness. Because personality might be very subjective, or people might always interpret that as, oh, well, it has to be recreative, or it has to be like for fun, or you're smoking to have fun. And our government tries to specifically define our use as recreative, right? And so has the court. And so what we try to always use is the term responsible personal use, right? Because the personal use might be spiritual, it might be traditional, it might be sexual, it might be for construction purposes. Like there's literally no limit in the sense of how you develop your consciousness. So it's something that is very amazing, because we're trying to tie that into other types of uses, like for example psychedelic mushrooms.
right. So I think the way it works with this jurisprudence declaration for the Supreme Court is once the Supreme Court rules 5 times that some law isn't constitutional, then the legislature is supposed to change that law. Isn't that right?
Yeah, they're supposed to fix the issue of a law being unconstitutional. So, but yeah, once you have those 5 cases won in the Supreme Court, then we get the jurisprudence, and it's up to the legislative powers to change the articles that are unconstitutional. And so they didn't, and they haven't. It had to be addressed by the Supreme Court, and the way that they fixed it, which is for us, is not the way to go, but it's what we have now. The way for them to say we're fixing this problem is our FDA now gives you a sanitary authorization so you can grow weed and you can possess it, right? And we find this to be a violation of our rights to privacy, right? Why should we get a permit to go ahead with an action that has been determined by the court that is not enough of a risk for anybody else? That they need to put you on the list, and that they need to have you submit papers, So we don't agree, but right now it's the way that we've been opening the door, and we're trying to get also for COFEPRIS to provide these sanitary authorizations immediately, and maybe even try to get an injunction against them, because again, why would they be the ones to tell me what I should do privately in my own home with my own plants?
Right. So have other issues gotten this jurisprudence with 5 Supreme Court rulings like this before? Has this process taken place on other issues?
Yeah, well, there's only one declaration, general declaration of inconstitutionality in Mexico before. This would be the second time that it happens. And the previous time was an issue of telecommunications. So, it was more about like business rights and large company rights than it was about individual rights. And so, companies can get an injunction too. But this is what's amazing about this declaration now. I would say it's the first one that truly values human rights, and that is being understood as an issue of a violation of personal rights.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you that there's this concept out there that the Supreme Court of Mexico has recognized, as the right to develop your personality. I think you termed it correctly in U.S. perspective, that the pursuit of happiness. And I've actually used the same term before. We're kindred spirits. I could see that it is your freedom of consciousness is a fundamental human right. And it's just amazing, I think, and wonderful that your Mexican Supreme Court has ruled this way. When the telecommunications company ruling went through, did the legislature respond and change the laws quickly?
Yeah, I mean, they did comply with that declaration, and so I believe it's also because it wasn't, taking on the prohibition of illegal drugs. So yeah, so for now it's clear that the federal government has had no real intention of providing a federal regulation, and I hopefully they will by these couple of years that Lopez Obrador has left, the Mexican president, but it's very likely that they won't. So now we're very focused on winning on local rights, on municipal rights or state rights.
So the president goes by AMLO. He has opposed this, though, hasn't he? He's hasn't been in favor of this change, even though he's considered not a business-oriented president. He's not like the most conservative party in Mexico. He's more kind of like the Democratic Party, maybe in the United States. Do you think that's an accurate statement?
Well, I wouldn't say it's an accurate statement because politics are very different. Morena, which is the party in charge now, they're a populist party, right? And so I wouldn't see the Democratic Party as a populist party.
No, it's a corporate party. We have corporate A and corporate B.
Yeah, exactly. And so this government is a very populist government that their whole campaign speech and their whole spiel is about helping the poor. And they have lots of social programs where they try to help underage kids finish high school or help elder people have their pensions, different things like that. But again, it's a very corrupt government, like it always has been. So I would say like the term for AMLO has been pretty surreal. He himself is a Christian person, right? So he is conservative, right? His views in how you would see life, a lot of them are conservative, but he's always been very a populist candidate and a populist politician. So he's always been like publicly in favor of the poor. And now, he clearly isn't in favor of having a federal cannabis regulation, but he doesn't really have any power in that sense, right? And when he was asked, like, would you do something against it if it comes to be? And he said no, because it's not something that he needs to do. So he said if the Senate and the Congress, they get together and they have a bill that they want to pass, then I'll be okay with it. And so, yeah, because he doesn't really have much choice. But the problem has been that the Senate and the Congress, they haven't really seen it as a priority. And even though we're outside of their doors.
Yeah, you're at their front door. They basically close their front door because of the protest and say it's under construction for a couple of years now, 2.5 years, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And that used to be the people's door, which is door one, how anybody that's not a senator or somebody that works in the Senate would access the Senate. And they closed that door for the whole public and for anybody that had business in the Senate. And it's been closed for over 2 years now for that reasoning that they had to build like an outside, like an elevator and an outside staircase, like a fire escalator. And obviously, like if you're the Senate, you could do that in a couple of months. You don't need to take over 2 years to do a simple project that's about an elevator.
Right. But let's go ahead and run that 2.5-minute interview I did a couple of weeks ago with Miguel Fernandez in front of the front door to the federal Senate in Mexico City. We'll be right back. So, Miguel, explain to our audience where we are and what this is, this little marijuana garden.
We are at Planton 420. This is, that we know of, the only publicly funded cannabis garden in the world. So we, several collectives, we came together to have this permanent protest. We started on February of 2020, so that's more than 2.5 years ago. We did this because the Senate had the obligation to regulate cannabis in a federal way.
And that's where we're at. We're right in front of the door to the Mexican Federal Senate.
That is correct. We're in front of the first door of the Mexican Senate. And we've been here for asking for 4 demands of the federal government, which is free possession for all marijuana users, free cultivation, shared spaces, and equality with tobacco users, and a fair and dignified treatment. So based on these 4 demands, we've been working with the Senate, with different senators, to try and pass a federal bill that will guarantee human rights. That has been difficult because there's a lot of interest in the taxing side and the international company side, but we believe that if the users and cultivators' human rights are respected, then the market is going to sort itself out. What we've seen in these few years while researching other countries' regulations is that they base the regulations on privileges. So the over-regulation has made a lot of the producers unable to operate fairly. They're not really making any money anymore. So we don't want that to happen here. So we're protesting here. We have workshops. We have a human rights school. We do cultural events, music events, sound systems, and we grow weed.
All right, thank you. So, is there any possibility that, or any hope currently that the legislature, the Senate, or the House of Deputies is going to move on this at all, or what strategy, if not, is there a strategy to deal with that?
Well, we believe that they're not. It's the end of AMLO's term, and they haven't seemed to have that will of providing us with a federal regulation, even though they had the Supreme Court on top of them. Now that they don't have the Supreme Court on top of them because they were held in contempt and the Supreme Court did the general declaration, now if there's no political will to give us that regulation in the past years, I don't think there's going to be in these 2 years that they have left. And our strategies to counter that now are working more locally, trying to free spaces or free up, we can say, municipal spaces instead of a whole federal regulation that they just don't want to provide. So, for example, in Oaxaca City, which is a very famous city in Mexico for the food, for the culture, the arts, and there's a lot of tourism. And so there's a lot of cannabis consumption. But it used to be clearly very penalized if you were smoking in the street in the city. And so recently we were able to negotiate with the municipal government through a series of controlled arrests that we did, and we coordinated in order to be able to prove that in the municipality of Oaxaca, there is no law that prohibits cannabis consumption in public. And so through that strategy, they had to give us a document that explicitly states that there's no prohibition to consume cannabis outside in public in Oaxaca City, and it's also an exhort to cops, to the police, to not bother any consumers in public. And so through these document, we started smoking all around the city, going over to all the public plazas, engaging with the police, engaging with lots of people, trying to see what the opinions of society are. We try to stay away from playgrounds or from schools. And at the same time, it's been a very successful exercise. So right now we're trying to negotiate with the municipal government so that maybe they'll open up tolerance in businesses. Like if you have a restaurant in the city and you have a space where people smoke tobacco, for it to be up to you, that you're the business owner, to decide if you also want people smoking cannabis in these spaces. And so we're trying to get that together with the municipal government.
So here in the United States, I've been a marijuana activist since I was a teenager back in the 70s. And back in the 70s, marijuana had been decriminalized in a few US states. But then there was some actions, and Ronald Reagan became president in the 80s, and he was against that completely. So we went back in time zone, and the federal government cracked down and actually implemented these huge mandatory minimum sentences. And they had public support up until recently, when we in Oregon, Washington, Colorado put marijuana legalization on the ballot in 2012, and in 2014 now we have marijuana legalization in about a third of the states. But the main thing that I'm getting to is that the public opinion has changed. It used to be that, 25%, 35% were in favor of legalization, and 60 to 70% were against it. What is the public opinion in Mexico? I know generally it's a little bit more conservative in terms of social changes like this. Do you have popular support in public opinion polls?
Well, the thing is that it's not something that has been added to polls. So there's very few information about it. Yeah, the polling that we have, like the national polling service, is called INEGI, right? So they go to people's houses and they do a survey of many different things, like age numbers and religion and how much you make and different things, right? So they do ask you if you consume illegal drugs, but that's the question, right? So if somebody's gonna go poll at your house and it's the government, it's not like like a favorable poll. It's not like, hey, do you want marijuana to be legal? No, it's like, hey, are you a drug user that's an illegal drug user? So I feel like that's not a way to get people to tell you.
And I don't think marijuana is illegal. And in fact, it doesn't seem like it is. So if you're asking, are you an illegal drug user in Mexico now? Well, the Supreme Court says, no, you aren't, right? So
exactly,
you're the highest court of the land, so you aren't. So that question doesn't really address marijuana anymore. Here in the United States, we have a lot of different polling companies and academic institutions. Probably they've been doing this polling for many years, going back to the 60s. And it shows that, about 7 or 8 years ago, public opinion shifted in favor of legalization. And now we actually have 70% support for legalization. So there are no private polling institutions out there that do independent polling on this issue?
No, not that we're aware of. I mean, not on these types of issues, right? There are private polling companies, but I would say this issue is very stigmatized.
Yeah.
So much so that people would. I mean, even people that do consume or do use cannabis in a way, a lot of people are still in what we call the green closet. And so like most people don't say that they smoke cannabis or that they use cannabis.
Right. So is there any movement in any of the political parties to change that, or any way to gauge public support, demonstrate you have that public support?
Well, right now we're doing all of this polling ourselves. We have a survey that's a very complete survey, and all of the work that we do or that we're doing through Planton 420 is completely free. And we've gotten at least 500 surveys. And so since they're long surveys, they're about 20-minute surveys. It's a pretty good number. And we're trying to get with other collectives and see if we can make this a national poll to have those numbers. I mean, to start having those numbers because I do think it's important. And I believe that there's lots of cannabis use in Mexico. Well, I mean, since probably every time you come, like for you, it's all about cannabis, and you're with people like me that are all our lives are about cannabis, but I would say most of the people, they're very passive consumers, or they're still in the green closet, and so they don't acknowledge publicly that they're consumers. So our survey, we're trying to break it into pieces so that maybe if someone doesn't want to say that they're a consumer, they don't have to. Just at least have that information that, are you pro legalization? Are you pro the verdict of the Supreme Court? Are you pro the injunctions that have been won? And I think most people, maybe even 99% of people, would be pro human rights.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard to be against human rights, I would think.
Yeah.
But I mean, we are human, right? So we want rights. We want our rights. But you know, in America, we would, and I hired polling companies to do polls on our initiative to demonstrate the support that's out there, and also to focus on what changes are popular and what changes are not popular in terms of the regulation of cannabis. So, but the Mexican Supreme Court really hasn't touched the commercial sale of marijuana. It's all about personal use and the ability to grow and possess and use your own cannabis.
Well, right now, the first commercial injunctions are being fought, and the first one in the Supreme Court has already been won. And so that opens a huge door. That happened recently, maybe about less than half a year ago, or about half a year ago. And this would be for the production and commercial use of hemp in Mexico, right? And
So
that
not
opens the door.
cannabis, not but just hemp for fiber and seed oil and food.
Exactly. Yeah, hemp for industrial use. That's the injunction that was won. But I mean, the next step, at some point, the next step, if we don't get a federal regulation anytime soon, would be to get commercial injunctions looking to sell products that have THC in them. And that's a bit more difficult to argument and to like win an injunction on it. But I mean, people thought it was very difficult to win the industrial hemp injunctions, and before that, they thought it was really difficult to win the personal use for the freedom to develop your personality injunction. So I think we're advancing pretty quickly, and I think it's amazing that this is happening from civil society and not from the state. Because it might be the only opportunity that we have in drug policy reform that this is being seen as a matter of human rights. I think all the other regulations that we've looked into and we've done a lot of research, they're all like the basis of those regulations is we're handing you a privilege as a citizen, right? And so privileges can be given to you in a finite amount, or they can be taken away, or they can be very restricted. And so that's what we're trying to change here, like the idea that cannabis use is a privilege, right? And I think we're going somewhere with it. And if everything comes through, we will be able to do whatever we want in terms of how we develop our consciousness with this plant, right? And they can regulate an industry. They can regulate like rules if you want to have a store or a dispensary if you want to sell. But I think the basis of everything that we're trying to do with drug policy reform is why are users in jail because of this? Why are users being stopped by cops and frisked, and there's an extortion involved? Why are people, losing their families or their kids over cannabis consumption? And so if we can get those things like looked at first and make sure that stops happening from a human rights perspective, I think that will be like the biggest win in cannabis that we can aspire.
There's this irrational fear of THC that somehow they've got to limit it, but marijuana and THC have never killed anybody.
Yeah.
In fact, when women start to breastfeed their children, before the milk starts flowing, the breast expresses endogenous THC that's the same as the active ingredient in cannabis. And that's when the mother transfers her immune system to the baby. So
Yeah.
this can't be dangerous. If not, if it was, why do all mammals on Earth give their newborn babies this endogenous THC? But still, there's this irrational fear. I'm really proud that Mexico has basis on human rights, because I have long been a believer that we have to expand human rights in the face of corporations and government, and make sure individuals have more rights to privacy and personality development. And
Yeah.
if you aren't hurting anyone else, and especially if you aren't hurting yourself, it's just wrong for them to prohibit this. And when you started this movement and you worked with your group to found Planton 420, you expected it, like you said, to be 90 days and that the Senate would do what the Supreme Court told them to do, just like they had before for the telecommunications company. But now
Correct.
it's been 2.5 years later and they haven't done anything. So they passed some bills in one house and then they took it to another house and they messed it up, and it just hasn't been reconciled between the two houses.
That is correct. And yeah, I mean, we were very naive in that at the beginning. We believe like, hey, in these 90 days, we can put pressure to have a federal bill that really incorporates human rights. And we didn't even get a bill. So I mean,
Yeah. And I understand that the bills that have been proposed, or didn't one of them pass one house? And
yeah,
then
like I would say, I think that was November of 2021, so almost a year ago. Yeah, I think that's when it passed, but it went from the Senate over to the Congress, to the Mexican Congress, and they have to either make changes and send it back or just fast track it. And so obviously they not only made changes, they submitted an analysis that the bill from the Senate violated 17 human rights. And so
Mexican activists felt the same way, that it was a bill that restricted human rights rather than expanded them.
correct, correct. Yeah, and we found over 30 human rights violations, like, and very severe human rights violations. They weren't even like in subjective terms or situational terms where several things have to happen in order for your human rights to be violated. From the first instance and how the articles were redacted, it was a very poor bill, right? And so the Mexican Congress, they made some changes and sent it back, and the changes that were made were also in violation of several other human rights. So I mean, they recognized the violations from the Senate, but then they went ahead and added more of them themselves. And so I mean, it was a very ridiculous situation, and that nothing happened from it. And that's where we are now. So again, we're trying to make sure that each state has a group of activists and that there is a strategy, and for people to start negotiating with their municipal governments or their state governments, because at the end of the day, if we can liberate the public space, a lot of the police extortions would end, right? Because now there wouldn't be a reason for them to stop and frisk people or arrest people for smoking marijuana. And for us, that would be a really big step. And since it's happened now in Oaxaca, and we've done it in several different places in Mexico City, we believe if 5 or 6 more cities in different states can do it, that will put a lot of pressure, because people will start smoking a lot in the street legally. But where are they getting that cannabis? They're getting it illegally, right? Unless they have a sanitary authorization to grow it themselves. but most people don't grow their own cannabis. So yeah, we're trying to find an angle to put the most pressure possible, and we believe this is it now, because clearly being in front of them, growing thousands of marijuana plants, smoking, having a plaza with at least 1,000 people fit there if it's a busy day,
Yeah,
and
I
imagine
saw
that you,
people
yeah,
smoking marijuana in the surrounding area. They didn't come in where the garden was at, but they
exactly,
were.
yeah, because they wouldn't fit. So there's over 1,000 people that use the plaza when it's the busiest time of day. We've made estimates that in a busy day, over 10,000 people can use that space, right? So imagine that. No, like no other issue has gathered tens of thousands of citizens per week in front of a federal building
In civil
in,
disobedience.
in civil disobedience. And even with all of this pressure, the Senate can still say, like, oh, well, it's still not a priority, right? Or we don't know how to come about the issues that may happen because of the legalization. So yeah, we think now the real pressure is going to come from the other states.
Yeah. So the Planton 420 movement started there in Mexico City in front of the Mexican Senate at the garden that we visited together a few weeks ago.
Correct.
Excuse me. But it's spread. Now I know it's in front of the Mexican, so there's a Planton garden in front of the Supreme Court in Mexico City. Is that correct?
Yeah, like
Many
when
different cities around the country now. It's not just in Mexico City. You have Planton 420 gardens in a lot of different. Can you name some of them? Some of the places where?
that is correct. Like I would say where things are more advanced is Planton 420 Oaxaca. Like each state is Planton 420 in their name. There's another physical planton, like another physical protest happening in Puebla. That's Planton 420 Puebla. And there's been other attempts in different cities like Monterrey or further up north in Tijuana, and we're advancing. I mean, a lot of the states, the issues that they sometimes face when they're trying to do civil disobedience or some type of activism might not just be the police. It might be organized crime. It might be the conservative society. So in several states, it has been harder than Mexico City. But yeah, we have a national network called Red Nacional de Plantón 420. And what it is just us trying to communicate all of our strategies, all of our civil disobedience acts that we may do in all of the different states, and trying to document them, trying to make sure that we get media coverage, trying to get negotiations with the municipal governments, and it has worked. I would say there's maybe some type of planton 420 in 14 out of the 32 Mexican states. So I mean, there's still a long ways to go, but I think 14 states is a lot of pressure, and if a few of those can make something happen locally, I'm pretty sure that will really add on the pressure to the Senate.
It's kind of like the ratio of states that have legalized marijuana in the United States, in terms of it being about a third or so in terms of the actual number. But the
Yeah,
large states like California, New York, with the most people, have passed it. And the same thing seems to be true there. I know Mexico City is the largest population base, right?
yeah, by a lot.
Yeah. And so, but it's happening now, like you said, in 14 out of 30. That's almost half, right?
Yeah, 14 out of 32. So yeah, close to half. And we expect by next year to have a few other states and get people to share their strategies, to be able to travel to those states. We tried to do that several times and in the past few months to go to the states, and be able to help out with the strategies, be able to go to the negotiations, because it is a very tough job. You need to be very, very prepared in order to negotiate with the government, whatever the subject matter is, but specifically in cannabis, since there's clearly a prejudice that the people that we use the cannabis plant in Mexico, it is seem like you're gonna be a mugger, or you're gonna be someone that doesn't have a house, that you're gonna be homeless. And in many of the states, like when something happens in the neighborhood, they'll say like, oh, that person was probably stoned, right? And they might not even mean like with marijuana, but that is what it means, right? Because they say it's marihuano, right? So stoned in English is not even that specific, but in Spanish it's marihuano, right? So there's no confusion there. But they, even if somebody is on solvents, or if somebody is drunk, or if somebody is just a bad person doing crime, they'll say, oh, that was a marihuano. And that's very common in Mexican society. So I think there's still a long way to go, but we are getting really far in terms of human rights. And hopefully the society around us will notice that this isn't gonna stop, and it's not gonna get less intense, right? The civil disobedience is only gonna be larger and larger. And at the end of the day, what we want is to make the government uncomfortable. That's part of the civil disobedience. And so some people, they get uncomfortable if the government gets uncomfortable, right? Not even if you're in your house and you've been there at the Senate, there's no houses around.
No.
It's all like
It's intersection in the country, right?
yeah, exactly. And so there's no houses. So it's difficult to say like, oh, that smoke reaches my baby in our house, or I don't know. But a lot of people, since the government is made uncomfortable, they're uncomfortable with our protest, and they have an issue with it, and they think like us smoking in the street interferes on the rights of others, right? And that is a very good conversation, because I mean, we also don't want like society in general to be uncomfortable. We want to make the government uncomfortable, but at the same time, how can you regulate smells, right? Because you can maybe regulate smoke, but just if you're talking like about smells, and a lot of the time that's all people say, like it smells like marijuana, and that bothers me, right? But you could say that about anything. It smells like smog in Mexico City, and that bothers all of us. It smells like tacos, and that might bother a vegan person, So
Right.
if a smell bothers you, that it's very hard to prove that there's an interference with your rights as an individual. And so
The courts here in America have ruled that some people enjoy the smell of marijuana, and therefore you can't say it's really offensive to everyone. So the courts have ruled that that's not a valid reason, that you don't like the smell. But
yeah,
then we also run up against the indoor air safety and smoking laws. So, but if marijuana users could just match the rights given to tobacco users, and tobacco is obviously much more dangerous and causes many more health problems and diseases, then that would still be a move in the right direction. So
yeah, for sure. And that's what we're trying to accomplish. One of our demands for the government is to provide spaces, shared spaces, in equality with tobacco users, because it's been proven that secondhand smoke of tobacco, has at least some risks for the people around it, and that has not been proven with cannabis. It has not been proven that cannabis has killed a single person in the world.
yeah, it's been the cannabis doesn't cause those problems that
Yeah,
that tobacco smoke does.
and so we're accepting having uh, shared spaces in equality with them, even though clearly uh, we do have those facts, right? That tobacco is unhealthy for people around it, not just for the one that's ingesting it. And so that's all we're asking. Like, if we're gonna smoke and we're gonna smoke equally, then we can start liberating the spaces. We can start using up our local resources to create clubs, create private spaces in restaurant and different types of businesses where cannabis use is tolerated, or it's even we could say it's even assisted. Like, for example, if a restaurant wants to at the same time provide you with a bong service, or whatever, something, things that don't entail selling cannabis, they should be able to do that. And so that's the next step, because if we guarantee the rights of all of us with these strategies, then at the end of the day, the industry is going to make up itself, and it's going to be like selling other types of produce.
Yeah.
Which in other states it's not like that, because again, since it's being seen as a privilege, it's regulated like, oh, this is something that is very at least, let's say, like very risky, right? There's many risks to marijuana consumption, and so since it's a privilege, you're not going to be able to do with it what you want, right? You're going to do with it what we tell you and how we tell you. And
I'm reminded of a book here in the United States I read back when I was a teenager called A Child's Garden of Grass by a guy named Margolis, theoretically. And it had a chapter on the dangers of marijuana. And the chapter was one sentence: getting busted. That's it. We are
That's
about
it.
out of time, Miguel. We've had Miguel Fernandez on with the Planton 420 movement in Mexico City and now across the whole country. Is there any, if our audience wants to contact and support you, or what is the best way to contact?
You can follow us at Planton 420 in Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Our website is also planton420.org, and that's PLANTON 420. So it's pretty simple.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, and thanks for giving me a tour a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure this has been a really informative program for not just our audience here in America, but I know there are other people watching in other countries that want to emulate this and are trying to use civil disobedience. One guy in Norway was fascinated when I told him about how the Supreme Court had ruled in favor of human rights. And we've had him on as a guest. But you hopefully will be able to come back at some point in the future and tell us about future battles won.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Paul. And hopefully in a few years, we can talk about how marijuana is fully legal and not over regulated in Mexico.
I hope so. Well, thanks for your work, and thanks again for the tour, and just keep working to restore hemp.
For sure.
All right.